watching Veracity Hill. Here is your host, Dr. J.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining me here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on political theology. I'll be talking with a friend that I'll introduce to you in a moment, but let me give you a quick refresher about who I am and what we're doing here at Veracity Hill. My name is Dr. Kurt Jarris. You might know me as Dr. J because for some people, they have trouble remembering how to say it. That's quite all right, and I am the host of the Veracity Hill podcast program, YouTube channel, and it's a great opportunity to come to you week in, week out. We rescheduled our normal Tuesday programming just to be on Thursday. I was watching my kids for a few days while my wife was out of state, but glad to be coming to you nevertheless here on YouTube, Facebook, and elsewhere. And it's, one of the reasons why we do Veracity Hill is to clarify complex issues. And it's so common that in America we think, we encounter these heated political subjects. And while there was just one yesterday afternoon up in Minneapolis, I don't know that my friend and I will be talking about that, but it's so important for Christians to know how we should think about these political issues. And it requires far more, I think, reflection in theology about the creature's relationship to the Creator and what all of that entails for how we even come to interpret small little specific instances or larger issues, such as what I'm sure we will talk about today about the United States and Venezuela. That was initially the impetus for this conversation. What has happened with the Trump administration and Maduro. We're going to be talking about that. But we also want to talk about higher level subjects. Like I said, what does it mean for us as little human creatures, and how that theology of humanness will impact our thoughts about political relations and international relations. And so that's the subject of today's episode. I talk about theology and apologetics at Veracity Hill. And if you haven't caught, in December I did some material on the census of Quirinius. That's an apologetic subject commonly presented. It's an objection lodged against the veracity of Luke's gospel account. So that's something that you might be interested to go check out if you haven't already. Be sure to subscribe to Veracity Hill on YouTube because we put out, on average, a video per day. So we live stream on Tuesdays, then we've got clips and shorts throughout the rest of the week and through the weekend. So there's a video coming to you every day. Be sure to not miss that by subscribing to Veracity Hill on YouTube. We also have other social platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. And just as a heads up, I don't check all of these platforms. I even fail weekly to check YouTube comments, and I should. My team at Defenders Media gets on me and says, they start cracking the whip sometimes saying, hey, you got to go respond to those comments. So actually last week we did a mailbag episode where I looked at some comments and then talked about the Knives Out film as we took in the new year. Okay, well, I really want to get to our conversation here with my friend. This is not the first time we've chatted, and we've held a formal debate in late August of last year on the topic of, does Romans 9 teach corporate election? And I think I handily won that one on a technicality. He might dispute it, though. My friend on today's episode is none other than Sean Luke. Sean holds a Master's of Divinity, a Master's of Systematic Theology, a THM. He has been published in many academic journals, such as the Scottish Journal of Theology, New Blackfriars Journal of Reformed Theology, and others. And he is the firepower behind Anglican Aesthestics on YouTube. My friend Sean, it is great to have you on our episode today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, brother. It's always a joy to be with you.
Yes, and for those of you who may not know, I know Sean personally. We both live in the western suburbs of Chicago. We actually live in the same town, as it turned out. And although he and I were Facebook friends for many years before that, I think while he was still in college, maybe even, Sean, when you were in high school.
I was in high school.
You were in high school. You were in theology groups on Facebook. I think that's how we interacted, and and honestly, I don't even know that I know where you're originally from, even though we've been friends for years now.
Well, I was born in New Jersey, but raised in Naperville.
Okay, so you are local, and I'm originally from Downers Grove, so we're both local Chicagoland boys. But yes, so it's fun because you and I have both been just enthralled with theological reflection and exploration. We have our own various interests, of course, but it's nice to meet someone else, especially in person, that you can just spar with. And as you know, I like to just kind of spar with you for the heck of it, just to put you on your toes.
It's always a blast.
You're a sharp guy. I appreciate the conversations I have with you. So I saw your take on the Venezuela situation. You've got a Substack that we can provide a link to for people in the live chat. I will work on dropping that. But tell me, for Veracity Hill's audience, I know they've heard you from our debate. Give us a little introduction about yourself and what's got you interested in theology.
So, as Kurt said, I'm Sean Luke. And my primary theological interest has actually been theological aesthetics for the past 10, 11 years, actually probably even longer than that now. It was largely how I came to Christ, was through a theology of beauty. Jonathan Edwards helped reframe the way I see the world. And I've never really left that topic since. And thinking about the topic of beauty starts to touch on every single other area of theology. It starts to touch on the relationship between beauty and the other transcendentals, which then touches on the doctrine of the Trinity, which then touches on the doctrine of creation and the doctrine of providence. And in this, what I've found here is, if you're thinking about the instantiation of the life of God in the cosmos, you're inevitably going to start thinking about political theology, because political theology is just the theology of the common good instantiated in the public. And we'll touch on why that is in a second. Theological aesthetics for me has been sort of the pathway to everything else that I'm interested in. Eventually, it led me to Anglicanism through a kind of crisis that happened in seminary, where one day I told my wife, I was like, there's a real chance I could go Roman Catholic, because my mind was changed on infant baptism. And she was like, okay, before you uproot our family, you should probably look at the original sources. It's like, that's smart. And Kurt actually knows my wife, Sophia. And that's very much a Sophia thing to say. And she was like, yeah, just make sure you're actually educated if you make this decision. So I did. And I read the original sources, and that essentially led me down to being a firm, committed Anglican. So that's me in a nutshell.
Good. Very good. Now, I do want to mention a caveat for those that are longtime listeners of Veracity Hill. You know that I enjoy. I was a poli-sci major. Was one of my majors in undergrad, and I enjoy thinking about political issues. What I hope you will never find at Veracity Hill is partisan politics. While I'm interested in reading political news, I am not the type of person that is so tribalistic that my person is always right and your person is always wrong, which is such the common modus operandi that occur in the news cycle. And I'm just not interested in that. I am interested in figuring out, our tagline, striving for truth. We want to know what is the truth here, and inevitably, like you mentioned, Sean, when we're thinking about the life of God, when we're thinking about what it means to follow Christ, we want to figure out how should we understand and interpret these justice and injustice issues. And so inevitably, we need to be informed by certain value propositions that we hold in our theological framework. So I think the way I view these sorts of things is that it's a top-down. We need to be well informed in our theological framework, because what we think about these higher level issues will trickle down to the singular instance of what we heard about on yesterday's news, or what happened last week, or so on and so forth, right? It's very difficult for us to interpret what we see and experience on a weekly basis if we didn't have these values and ethical values, these beliefs not merely I don't want to say it's merely and only values, but our convictions about what is true in ethics and what gives grounding to that. Well, so as a Christian, we'd say it's God. God is love. God is righteous. And so those concepts inform and for Christians ground these truth propositions. And, non-Christians, or I should say, naturalists, for example, let's put them as one camp. They've got their own issues in terms of how they're going to try to ground ethics. That's an entirely different conversation. It's a fun one, mind you. It's a fun conversation to have, but we're not so much thinking that. Instead, we're thinking on today's episode, hey, what does it mean for a Christian to think about political theology? What does it mean for a Christian to think about international relations? I was particularly struck by an analogy you gave on the Trump-Maduro thing. So maybe before we get into that specific case, maybe we need to start with like international relations. And so I'm happy to let you take it away and give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, yep. And to agree with that, so a couple of quick words. I'm deeply sympathetic with the listener who says, I really just want to follow Jesus and I don't want to think about politics. Because I was there. I understand what that's like. But when you think about doing all you do to the glory of God, and when we think about what that means, right, from Scripture, well, the glory of God in Exodus 34 is the self-revelation of God in all things. That's what it means for God to glorify himself. It means for him to reveal himself. Which is why it's connected with images like light. What does light do? Light reveals. When we think about doing all we do to the glory of God as the church, that our task is to sort of bring about the self-revelation of God in the world. Well, then that has implications for interacting with society. What does it mean to bring about the glory of God in our neighborhood? What does it mean to bring about the glory of God in our community? And because a community is bound by ties of politics, right, which is just the structure of public interactions, inevitably you're going to have to think about the question, okay, what does it mean to bring about the glory of God in the structures of my community, aka in politics? So that's what leads you to a question like this. Now, so let's think a little bit about this question historically from the tradition. So when we read something like Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, in Book 1 of the Politics, in Book 1 of Nicomachean Ethics, he gives a really striking statement that today we'd be kind of shocked by, where he says that the telos of ethics, the goal of ethics, is politics. And why does he say that? Now, we want to separate that in modernity. We want to separate morality and politics from each other. But for Aristotle, because man is a social creature, he has this famous line where he says man is a political animal. That just means man is a social creature. How do we obtain the goods required for our bodily lives and things like this? We build relationships and communities, and we help each other, right, acquire those goods. So if that's part of the structure of our nature, then the reason the telos, or the goal of ethics, which is pursuing the good life, is political is because, well, the goal of human existence is social, right? The way we're wired as human creatures is towards community. And because of that, then, the pursuit of the good life will lead you to the fulfillment of your nature, which will lead you to building social bonds with those around you. And that is, for Aristotle, the foundation of politics. So politics, then, is just the task of instantiating the common good, with the good being the ultimate good. Whatever vision we have of that, it's that ultimate good brought about in the life of our community. So if that's the case, then for Aristotle, the foundation of a state, which is a bond or society of associated individuals, men and women, who are bound together to secure their bodily life, to facilitate the pursuit of the common good together. For him, the foundation of that is going to be your constitutional form, which is essentially that form of life through which men and women agree to live together, whatever that form is. And then he goes through a number of different forms of the politics, like democracy or tyranny or whatever. And you could read that in his book, In the Politics, particularly in book 3 is where he's going to touch that. Now, for when we think about that, okay, so the nature of the social order of a political society is of a group of people bound together in order to pursue the common good. then there are certain levels at which we can think of societies that are bound together. The smallest unit of which being the household, right? So in a household, what happens is that I covenant with my wife to establish a form of life through which other individuals for whom I am responsible are brought about. And that
we won't get to the details of that, but yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, well, yeah. Hopefully you'll. And that is going to be the microcosm upon which we sort of then build larger circles, right? So then, okay, that's a microcosm of a bigger macrocosm, like a community, maybe a town or whatever. Mm-hmm. And that town is that covenant or constitution established at a broader level. And the broader we go out from that, that's going to constitute a state, right? A state is going to be a society of households that are bounded together, that have consented to live together under certain terms. So the norms of the household then, are going to govern or serve as the analogical pattern for the norms of the community at large. Mm-hmm. And so we actually have this rich tradition then from the Christian tradition, from Aquinas in the Secunda Secunda, where he writes on laws, in Hugo Grotius, and I have a couple of quotes I can read at some point here as well, and from Richard Hooker, who is part of my own Anglican tradition, that the laws we frame in community, for a community, are drawn from natural law, the law that God has written into the structure of the cosmos that facilitates things towards their proper good. And the goal of human law is to so frame life that we're participating in that natural law. We're participating in our facilitation towards that ultimate common good, which is ideally, right, as Christians, we think that's the instantiation of the life of God and community, right? Well, that's going to then have certain implications for how we regulate ourselves. Now, when we think then about the question of war, okay, so if it's the case that the community at large is a macrocosm of households, the community just is households that are covenanted to live together to help each other pursue the common good, then the norms that regulate the rules of just conflict between households are going to be the analogical pattern for the rules that regulate just conduct between communities, because communities are, as it were, macro persons that are constituted by household units. They are bodies in that sense. So here's what the analogy Kurt's talking about then. Let's then apply this to thinking about Venezuela, right? Well, suppose there's someone I don't like, right? We'll call him Jimmy McDuff, right? Jimmy McDuff is the head of a different household. And I'm just going to assume for the sake of argument, we're going to touch, I think, probably on the questions of whether Trump is really invading Venezuela for oil or things like this. But let's just grant, let's make it the strongest case possible. Let's just grant that the reason Trump invaded Venezuela and took Maduro was because, well, he wanted to liberate the Venezuelan people from an illegitimate ruler, okay? Let's say there's another head of household, like Jimmy McDuff, right? I don't like the way he's conducting himself. I don't like the way he's conducting his relationship with his children. And in fact, his children don't like him either. So I go into his household in the dead of night, I kidnap him and tie him up in my basement, and then consider and declare Jimmy's family liberated. Okay, would that be just? It certainly would.
Yeah, we would all say. Yeah, we would all say in this analogy that it's unjust because you can't trespass on another man's property. You can't kidnap him, and so with this analogy you're describing, yes, we would say it's unjust. I'll let you continue before I raise my objection. Yep.
So given that, right? So given that that's unjust, even though Jimmy's kids might be like, yes, thank you for liberating us from this tyrant dictator, right? I have not gone through the proper channels of authority by which I would ordinarily take Jimmy away from his family, right? We're both consented to live together in a sort of covenantal community.
Yeah, and so you'd call the police, for example. You know. That would be the proper avenue. If you hear Jimmy's beating on his kids and you think it's, child abuse and not horseplay, and maybe you see it through a window or something, you call the police. You don't go onto the guy's property as much as one might be tempted to put an immediate end to the injustice. There are proper avenues that we've created in our society for that.
Right. Now, given that, the reason we would punish something like that, me going into the basement taking Jimmy, tying him up in my basement or whatever, is because that sort of behavior, even if we all think Jimmy's kind of a jerk, that sort of behavior destabilizes social order. Because social order requires that A, we live together under certain consented norms, and B, that we have mechanisms such that I am not acting as an individual agent to just impose my holistic vision of the good on someone else, and then destabilize their household. So what we need then, and what Hugo Grotius then points out is, the objection to this sort of way of thinking, is, there is no international community. There's no international body of law, there is an international community. But there's no international body.
I'd say that there is an international community, but there's no governing authority to oversee this community. Yeah.
Now, here we have to think back to what we've discussed from Aristotle, and Hooker and Aquinas. Civil law is designed to participate in natural law. The reason that's relevant is because civil laws and contracts that we make with each other ideally are not supposed to be arbitrary. They're made in order to secure that overall cosmic order in which we find ourselves. So even if there's no sort of joint world government, the question is, what are the stipulations of natural law such that my action towards, or my state's action towards the actions of another state does not destabilize that order and still allows for the sharing of a common life internationally? The problem with acting in the way we have, in my opinion, is that in the same way that it destabilizes the broader communal order for me to do that to Jimmy, it destabilizes international order for one state to do that to another state without some sort of recourse to an international community by which we can know we are not destabilizing that order in which we live. So that would be the sort of foundation. That would be the analogy we use that as the spring off point here.
Yeah. So, and I would say this sense of destabilizing the international community. Suppose that there's there might be times when destabilization of an existing order is actually a good, to disrupt the lull, the staleness, or to disrupt the direction that the international community is headed toward. And so this is where we've got in our live chat this comment from Anselman 3156. You cannot discuss Venezuela properly without considering all the motives behind the official narrative and who stands to benefit from that intervention. So I'll say this. Let's think about what the motives could be, We might not ever actually come to a conclusion on what the motives were. One motivation could be this. Trump is foreseeing that World War III is on the precipice, maybe not this year, but perhaps in 2027, and he wants to try to do what he can. And when I say Trump, I mean the administration, I mean the executive branch, the spy community. So this is not just Trump, this is not just even Biden, this is not, because there are people left over that are employed in these positions for most of their careers, those are the mid to lower level grunt workers in the government. So this is not just one ad. So I use Trump as shorthand for the United States government. Okay. Perhaps the generals came to Trump and said, hey, we would need to do X, Y, and Z in order to cut off resources that Russia and China would benefit from. So Trump believed that, hey, attacking Venezuela would be an approach to disrupt the trajectory of what World War III could look like, where there is a big oil supply from their partners. So, with that stated as a possible motive, it seems like that could be a plausible explanation for a good reason to destabilize the status quo.
Yep. Yeah, so let's assume that's the case. And here's why I'd want to argue it still requires an appeal to some larger mechanism of authority. And I'm going to address obviously how that's complicated. So again, it might be the case, right? So going back to the analogy of the household, and I'll address what I know to be the gap in the analogy. If Jimmy, right, is, if I don't tie him up, he might import oil, he might make some dirty, underhanded deals that actually threatens my security and the security of my community. Even then, I don't actually have sanction to go in and tie up Jimmy. Now, the objection to that is going to be, well, because we have consented together to live and share a common life that's bound together by certain norms. But remember, those norms are ideally supposed to reflect the norms of natural law through which order is upheld. So then the question is, okay, at the international level, in the absence of an official sort of world order, what are the mechanisms of discerning international order, right? And here's what Hugo Grotius says, and this is actually, and I'm going to explain how this is actually echoed in Richard Hooker as well. Or actually, I guess Hugo Grotius echoes Hooker because he comes after. I don't know who comes first, but in any case, so this is from The Rights of War and Peace, and this, I believe, is from either book 1 or book 2, but this is from, again, On the Laws of War and Peace. So, quote, and just to give some context, Grotius is talking about how do we discern the contours of international law, and he says the following: we will begin with the human as more generally known. Now, this is either a civil right or a right more or less extensive than the civil right. The civil right is that which is derived from the civil power. The civil power is the sovereign power of the state. A state is a perfect body of free men united together in order to enjoy common rights and advantages. The less extensive right, and not derived from the civil power itself, although subject to it, is various, comprehending the authority of parents over children, masters over servants, and the like. But the law of nations is a more extensive right, deriving its authority from the consent of all, or at least many nations. It was proper to add many, because scarce any right can be found common to all nations except the law of nature, which itself is too generally called the law of nations. So here's his point. Here's how we discern international law. When we're thinking about discerning the good, and this again is echoed by Richard Hooker, discerning the good, our most ordinary means to do that in any domain of knowledge is consent, is the general consent of the relevant experts, right? So for instance, if I want to know what the literary classics are, what do I do? So the good relative to the domain of literature, I consult the consent of the relevant experts. If I want to know the good relative to building a building, right? Then I want to consult the consent of the relevant experts of architects, right? In a similar way, Grotius is saying, if you want to know prior to the establishment of any world order, because we don't have that, and no one is saying we should have that. If you want to know what the good is, then you have to find that mechanism through which we find the broadest consent as to what the good of international order would be. In the modern era, after World War II, the way we've done that, at least in the West, is through the UN, right? The United Nations was actually, it's premised actually philosophically on this issue. It didn't come out of a vacuum. Mm-hmm. No political thought thinking does, right? The UN formed right at the tail end of World War II because it's decided that, well, we actually do need a kind of more official mechanism than just shooting at the breeze, right? To discern international consent as to international order. That doesn't elide the distinction between nations, but the UN serves as that sort of public mechanism that publishes as best as we can the consent of the many nations. So the way the US, as part of the UN, has at least officially decided to conduct itself is through appealing to the UN for, at least for some form of approval or sanction prior to acting in a capacity of what Grotius calls war. And war, again, doesn't have to be like you're conducting like a 30-year war against another nation. It's basically you're using force to remedy some problem you have with another state.
Mm-hmm.
So for the U.S., if we're going to do that against another state, we're going to take military action to use force against another state. We need some sort of indication that we're operating by those wider principles to which we've bound ourselves. And where can those principles be found? Right now, it's in the UN. Now, one can always say, okay, well, screw the UN, like we do what we want. And the problem there is, well, then we're not actually attending to the consent of the many nations as our central epistemic means by which to discern the international good.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. So I've got a couple thoughts and comments here. So, one challenge is with the UN is that we're not saying the UN is the magisterium. We're not saying that.
Right.
So the UN is just a collection of limited people. Nobody, so far as I know, is saying that the UN is, divinely inspired by the Holy Spirit to be always correct. Right. And so we do see times where the UN gets it wrong. Right. Now, of course, I would, for example, agree with the ground for the Nuremberg trials after World War II. And what was cited there in that court case was that there is a law above the laws of men. And that's what gave it ground and warrant. So, I'm with you on a lot of this about consent and going to a higher authority beyond any given one state. But I do have concerns that. So one is that, hey, the UN gets it wrong sometimes. Two, think about this strategically, militarily. If you were to first go to the UN, you lose absolutely any element of, say, surprise. Now, one of the really fascinating features of what happened with the U.S. Arresting, I'll use the legal term, arresting Maduro, was that there were no American lives lost. This was an in and out operation, and the timing of it was just, by military standards, it was phenomenal. Now, that is in terms of the outcome, that's option A. Option B is we perform a traditional war where we send our troops to go on land and start a traditional invasion, and we go to war. So that's option B, and I perceive that your position, correct me if I'm wrong, would entail option B, that we would first seek the consent of the UN.
So let me clarify. The consent of the UN is because the UN doesn't function as a magisterial body, right? Operating by the consent of the UN is a matter of operating by the principles that we have all agreed to. Because not the nations of the UN, whether in Europe or not, right? Like none of them have agreed to sort of pass every sort of military action they take by the sanction of the UN.
Right.
So the important thing there is operating by the principles sketched there. One of those principles being proportionality. Another of those principles being we don't act unilaterally. We don't engage an act of war unless an act of war has been committed already against us. So there's proportionate response. So all of those things are sort of what I'm talking about. The reason this is significant is because we actually just completely disregarded any of the principles we've agreed to by which to conduct ourselves in an act of war. And people don't want to call this an act of war. When we consider war as the use of force against another state, either to prevent perceived wrongs or in response to perceived wrongs, then war, in the traditional sense that we're thinking about it, in terms of like people going to fight each other, that really is just like that conflict escalated, right? It's that principle just kind of escalated. That's all war is. So when I'm using war, I'm using it in this sort of technical sense. So we don't sort of engage in active war unless an act of similar war has been committed against us, and we can't respond in a way that's disproportionate. So again, the sort of taking out of another head of state, like imprisoning that other head of state, right, trying them in the U.S., things like this, when they haven't done a similar proportionate wrong to us. So it's the fact that we failed to act by the principles by which we've at least ostensibly agreed to on the international stage. That would be the failure here.
Yeah. Now, I could imagine that there might be some overriding good. There's an overriding principle which would say, hey, and I'm just thinking through this thought experiment here, right? Because again, we don't know the true motivations. But so suppose we could think of an overriding principle that would, pun intended, trump that other principle you're talking about for this community. So that would mean, say, hey, we've got this reason X, we'll call it X, and suppose the administration is having a strategy meeting, and they say, our friend Jean-Luc has reminded us that we have abided by these principles with the international community, but principle X really says, hey, we shouldn't actually do those other things that we agreed to because it might lead to worse outcomes. Is that a case where it seems warranted or justified for the administration then to act contrary to those principles?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so those limit cases of like, okay, what happens when we disagree with the UN, but we can't abide by the principles to which we bound ourselves. So there are two ways to think about that. One is we actually sort of just take the loss and abide by those principles because the good of international order is actually a greater good.
Right.
Like that's actually the sort of comprehensive good in which you can have sort of other sort of international state goods in the first place. So I would say unless something compromises. Now, let's say the UN has been taken over. Right, like so, they've just been sort of completely co-opted, and people. I'll argue why I don't think this is the case, right? But they've just been completely co-opted, and well, at that point, right, I would argue that the UN doesn't actually like that. The organization that was the UN has ceased to exist. If that were the case, so one would have to make that strong of a case if they wanted to say we are at liberty to sort of just jettison those things now. That really the agency or that body with which we agreed to act in order to preserve international order, it no longer exists.
Yeah.
And I'm open to hearing that, but that would be one of those cases.
I mean, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I'm pretty sure there'd be a lot of people within the Trump administration that do think that the UN is just a clown show at this point, and we should just ignore it.
And there's a difference between the UN being kind of like, you know, administratively bloated and kind of dysfunctional versus it no longer holding to the principles which bound those nations together. And I think it's the latter that many people would say, yeah, but you're right. There's like, administrative bloat and inefficiencies. And this, I think people are past that at this stage. Yeah. Yeah. And so at that point, I've not heard a case to say that the UN of today is not the UN that we sort of consented to bind our lives with in the wake of World War II.
I'm sure that there's some article out there that I could dig up, and we'll maybe have to read it after we
I'd be happy
finish
to,
our chat here. Okay, so, but you have now, correct me if I'm wrong, you have now provided a pathway for a plausible justification of the events that have transpired. So suppose someone says, we can't trust the UN anymore, because it's corrupt, it's wayward, it's the org that we once knew and once was this international covenantal commitment is gone. And so we are left to ourselves, and many people still depend upon America to, in a sense, serve as the police force of the international community. Again, this is not to say whether we should be there or there, or this and that, but just following this pathway here. So then the administration comes together, they have a strategy meeting, they say, what is the way we could accomplish the end goal without losing life? You know, what's the best extent, best case scenario, right? Because when we think about like just war theory, right? There's, you know, whether the cause is just, and then there's the way that the war is conducted. So we're thinking here on both of these issues, and so the administration says, hey, this is the way, element of surprise. We're going to send a presence in the in the community for a couple to a few weeks, because I know that there were naval ships forming a blockade. And then, boom, I mean, it kind of took a lot of people by surprise that there was this operation that occurred to arrest Maduro. But it obviously well planned out, took months of planning. I mean, they had built, from what I've read online, that there was a spy on the inside. Maduro had we had an inside man that gave us all the information, and boom, in and out, quick operation, no loss of American life. And I would think that it's a great outcome for the goal that was desired.
Yep.
So now that's a pathway.
That. So now let's grant. So to make the argument even stronger, let's grant that the chief mechanism by which we've set up to discern the consent of nations, right? The UN utterly failed, utterly unreliable, can't trust it anymore. So now what do we do? Okay, well, Grotius has an answer for that, and actually so does Hooker. At that point, then, you look to the swath of principles that have been held through time and across nations, and then measure yourself by those common principles to see if that justifies the action of one state towards another in a similar way to how, let's say we were in a state of kind of nature, right? There are households, state of nature, right? Which is a state where I'm not bound up with another household in a common community. Okay, so there's no overarching community. Now, there is actually, in that case, Locke points out, and I think Locke is right here. I think he gets a number of other things wrong we can go into, but I think he's right about this, that if there were no overarching community at that point, right, in the same way that in Genesis 9, right, whoever sheds the life of a man, by a man shall his life be shed, right, that would apply on the level of individuals if there were no overarching sort of community by which we bound ourselves together. So let's say that's the case, right? And let's say there's one household and another household, right? Well, now I don't like Jimmy. I don't like Jimmy McDuff, right? Jimmy McDuff he's even trying to sell drugs to my kids. You know? So then the question is, okay, there is no overarching community to which I appeal. So how do I discern how to justly act here? At that point, then, I'd have to recourse to the principles of justice that are commonly held through at least the wide swath of humanity, right? Well, and not just presently, but also through time as well.
Right. So we don't even have to go that far back. I mean, so the question is, what did we do pre-UN? Right. So the UN hasn't even been around for 100 years. So what was what was it that led America to think, hey, we're going to go to war against those people? So like you said, we would look at these timeless principles, timeless truths.
Yeah. And the things that induce, and I actually think it's funny. I used to be very I can't, America only got involved in World War II because it was in our own. And I used to be really angry about that. But then the more I've thought through these questions, the more I'm well, actually, what other, why else would you? Because if in the same way that unless the actions of there were no overarching community with under which I was bound with another household, right? Why would I sort of subject my household to that state of conflict unless it was to protect my own household, right? And then you have to ask, okay, if it is, because some people then are going to make that argument, well, it's really, Venezuela is importing drugs into the U.S., and so it's a national security issue. Okay, then the question is about proportionality. So now if that, let's just grant that that's true too, right? So I'm just going to give a lot of this, because I want to say, even if we grant a lot of this, I still think what we did was wrong. So let's just grant that, right? Well, then the question is proportionality. If Jimmy's family is trying to sell drugs to my kids, do I kidnap Jimmy and lock him up in my basement? Or do I just forbid Jimmy from ever contacting my kids? And then if he violates that, use increasing then force insofar as he violates that, right? But is the first proportionate response to then say, okay, I'm not going to let him, if he comes to my house, I am going to push him. I might even beat him up a little bit, right?
Okay, let me build on your analogy here, because my concern is that it's too simple, right? So suppose you say that you threaten you're going to beat him up. Well, he then all of a sudden brings his friends to his home to protect him. Yeah. And then you say, well, hey, I'm going to go call my friends, and then you can see how this escalates.
Right. Yep.
And so if you want to avoid escalation, especially if one of Jimmy's friends is like a bodybuilder, what do you do? So again, I'm just saying that I think
it is a fair pushback, because then at that point, then we do have to talk about particularities. So that's a fair point. Yeah, and that's a fair pushback. So then when we particularize it to the situation, so that's the point at which I'd be like, yeah, okay. And at that point, like, I'm not going to concede more than what I have conceded, for the sake of argument. So then at that point, when we analyze the particulars, right? So let's say that if I act against, I have a number of allies as a household, right? So I have a household and I have a number of other allies throughout the world. And if I don't act to tie, like, in some way, right? Well, Jimmy might get his household allies, right? So I need to do something. But I also need to do something in such a way that I'm not destabilizing the order that I have with my other allies, who can then function as a repository through which, or as a sort of wider body through which, general social order is facilitated.
Well, and I'm with you. And my worry is that, say, a land invasion would have caused greater destabilization. It would have made the international community worse.
Yeah. So I don't think the answer would have been a land invasion. So I actually think part of what we probably should have done first is increasing sanctions on Venezuela, even like banning, because banning immigration from Venezuela, I think is a proportionate response. If those threats are real, banning immigrants from Venezuela is a proportionate response.
But that's interesting, because then you get into sanctions, and as you likely know, sanctions are a form of war. Do we want then the people of Venezuela to suffer? We're telling them that they cannot escape and flee to our nation. They have to live and suffer in their nation. So it's an immensely complex issue.
It is, yeah. And the reason I think at the level of the state, now at the level of the church, the action might be different, but at the level of the state, because of who the state is responsible to, right? So the state is the sovereign power that has committed to facilitating the constitution that binds a particular people together, right? So our sovereign power, and for Grotius and then for Aristotle as well, that's actually the conjunction of deliberative, executive, judicial, right? And of course that carries itself over. So for us, we've divvied that up, right? Those powers. So those powers, so the sort of conjunction of the president, the Supreme Court, and Congress, are responsible particularly to the American people. And so they have to actually act for the interest of. Now, again, the church at large might act for wider interests, right? So the church might try to send missionaries into Venezuela or whatever. But at that point, then the government's responsibility is for the welfare of its people, first and foremost, and then you can do subsidiary things after that. So in a similar way that the head of a household, his primary responsibility is actually to his own kids, first and foremost, to secure their well-being. Yeah.
So the analogy about the household, I think, eventually breaks down somewhere, right? Because with households, the caveat you brought up was like state of nature, because that would be what it would be like at the international community level. When we talk about a household, we think, we've got state laws, and so we can't trespass on people's property. We can't. Well, there is no international governing body that says, as a matter of legal rules, with punishment, that you can't invade another nation. I mean, there's literally nothing like that. Now, of course, there's peer pressure, and there are threats like, hey, if you invade us, we're gonna respond, or we're gonna attack you then from this direction. So there's a lot of that goes on. But in that sense, to me, and maybe here's you and I might disagree, I would say that there is a sense of international chaos, but that the chaos is managed by principles that we have, and by those primary ordered interests of protecting our citizens. Because if you say you're going to go to war, well, now all of a sudden you're putting your people at risk to die. So those are your interests that you're putting in play at the international level.
So, so good. So at that point, then, let's talk then through the particularities of has the UN been corrupt? So fair point. So then once we put in the particularities of, okay, like what are the mechanisms of discerning the sort of state of international order, right? So Grotius, Hooker tell us that that's about discerning consent, right? The consent of the many. Okay, well then we have to talk about the fact that in the 20th century, our chief mechanism of doing that has been the UN. Someone has to make the case that the UN no longer represents the consent of the many nations by which international order is upheld. And I haven't, such that it justifies us not really acting in accordance with those principles anymore. Because, again, going back to that household idea, it's possible that one wants to avoid an invasion, right, sending their kids. But let's say they tie up Jimmy, right, and then they've just destabilized, they've just gotten maybe 10 or 12 households now set against them. Mm-hmm. So doing that action actually then does end up endangering your own kids at that point. In an analogous way, we'd have to ask, okay, given that we have seemed to jettison the principles of the UN and now we're threatening Greenland,
that's a whole different beast.
But it's related to that idea of, okay, like, have we acted in such a way that shows that we actually really don't any longer care about upholding the broader sort of international political order in which we exist? And I would make the case, I don't think the UN has been compromised to that extent. At least it doesn't seem to me like I don't see a reason to think, like, you can't point to administrative bloat alone and say administrative bloat, ergo they've rejected their fundamental principles. Like, that's just not, or they're just being logistically incompetent.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Okay, so in order to persuade you, I'll have to do some digging and see. I mean, certainly I think you and I would agree that the Trump administration would not care what the UN
I think so.
says.
Yep, I think so.
And so at least to persuade you on how to interpret whether what the administration has done is at the least permissible, right?
Right.
We don't need to find ourselves in full agreement, but something as of a lower bar like permissibility.
Yeah.
And this isn't to say I'm quite confident, Sean, you and I both agree Maduro was a evil dictator. I mean, so the ends are sort of nice. I mean, we're still kind of waiting to see how this all plays out, of course.
Yeah.
But of course, the ends don't justify the means, and so the question is what are the means in which this occurred? And we haven't even gone into the war powers resolution and whether that was so. That's a whole nother level. Whether what the administration has done is acceptable in the eyes of the federal government. Of course, I will say that this is type of behavior that has occurred throughout various administrations in the past, and so it's not just a Trump thing getting into partisan talk. But it's okay. It is.
I think Obama did stuff like this too.
It is fascinating to see the hypocrisy, I think, with the partisanship. It's so annoying to me because it flip flops every 4 or 8 years if it wasn't their guy doing it, And that's one reason why I just avoid the partisan stuff. I'd rather just get deep into the weeds and think about whether I think that particular case was justified or not.
Right. Yeah. Right. So and I think that's a fair, sort of a fair way of framing this is under what conditions would this be permissible? And I think that's exactly the right way to think about this. And the recourse that I think Grotius, Aquinas and Hooker give us is back to the idea of preserving that common order in which all nations are bound. So that would be then the question of whenever we're talking about international statecraft, respecting that, because even on one level, even if it is advantageous, let's say in theory we're responding to some wrong, right? That Venezuela did that. If it so radically destabilizes that order in which we all are bound to each other, then that actually does end up being a concern down the road for the U.S., right? We lose all our allies, they turn against us, things like that.
Right. That's a worse outcome. And now you might have scenarios in which, as you and I like to think about these thought experiments, you and I could imagine a scenario in which the means were all proper and righteous, and the outcome is still that we've lost all our allies.
Yeah. And that's where Grotius and Hooker talk about the goal of trying to discern the good, right?
Yes.
And when we're thinking about the discernment of the good, we're also looking, because it might be the case that at any individual time slice, most of the world is corrupt, right? But what's unlikely is that when we look at the wide swath of history and we're comparing our actions towards the wide swath of history, that has formed our moral conclusions. Unless we want to undermine our whole system of morality that we hold to right now, then if we're inconsistent with those principles that have subsisted across time, then we have a problem. So I think that that's actually a viable recourse in the absence of, in the absence of the right prior to 1940, what did they do? Well, that was more or less Grotius and Hooker are basically describing what they did. They're trying to do their best to discern the principles of international order, which is then the foundation of international law.
Exactly. That's what we're trying to do here. And Sean, I know we've got to wrap up here, but I've really appreciated chatting with you, listening to you speak so deeply. I hope that what people will come away with is maybe they've gone a little closer into figuring out what they think and how they should think about these particular issues. But most of all, that we as Christians can and should think deeply about these subject matters, not so simplistically, not soundbite theology, that this does require deep, careful reflection when we are trying to strive for those ethical truths. Sean, thanks so much for coming on the show today, and I hope to bring you on another time. It's so easy to talk to you, and I enjoy listening to you.
Man.
So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Great. We'll be in touch. Blessings to you.
Bye-bye.
All right, well, that does it for our show today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons. Those are folks that just chip in a few bucks each month. You can become a patron of Veracity Hill by going to veracityhill.com/donate. Also, I want to thank our sponsors, Defenders Media, Apologetics 315, and Rethinking Hell. I want to thank our guest today, Sean Luke, for letting us borrow his mind power for an hour or so. And I want to thank the team at Defenders Media for all the fine work that they do week in, week out. Gabe, Sophia, Mark, Dante, we've got Kyle, we've got Peter and Kevin, and it's a small little team that helps Veracity Hill to go and grow, so thank you to them at Defenders. Last and certainly not least, I want to thank you for listening or for watching in as we're striving for truth on political theology.
This has been Veracity Hill, a viewer and listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.